Hey folks, welcome back to another JavaScript Jabber. This week on our panel we have Dan Shapir.
Hello from Tel Aviv.
We also have AJ O'Neill.
Yo, coming at you live from pneumonia or corona or something. Oh,
wow.
Better, man.
I'm Charles Max Wood from Top End Devs. I'm just going to shout out about AI Dev Bootcamp. Page will be up today. We also have a special guest this week. It is Uncle Bob Martin. Bob, how are you doing?
I'm pretty good right now. Life is treating me very well.
Yeah, we've chatted a bunch, and Dan tossed a video over to me where you were. Let's say this as controversially as possible. You were bagging on all our favorite frameworks, and so He asked if we could invite you on, and I'm like, yeah, Bob's always game for that kind of thing. So you're here.
I'm here. Fire away when ready.
Yeah, maybe it's worthwhile. But before we start, I just need to tell AJ, AJ, that pneumonia has one distinct advantage over, COVID or the cold. You know what that is?
no.
It's usually bacterial.
Well, we've got medicines for pneumonia.
So you can usually take an antibiotic and get rid of it.
I mean, I don't want to turn this to a health episode, but pneumonia is a symptom that means fluid in the lungs and can be caused either virally or bacterially.
Yeah, that's fair. That's true.
Then get the bacterial kind, and then you'll...
Good advice.
Okay, so...
Take it back to Walmart and get the other brand.
Since we're already here, so one of the things that happened that I think set me back was I took some cough medicine and I coughed while taking the cough medicine. And the cough goes like, right? And so then the cough medicine went into my lungs. And then it got way worse.
Oh, yeah.
So
yeah.
I might still be recovering from the actual inhaling cough syrup.
I'm always surprised with my kids. I have a kid in elementary school that I'm always surprised I'm not sick like every other week. And then I was thinking, well, I only have one in elementary school anymore, but my wife is the lunch lady. So I am surprised I'm not sick every other week. But anyway,
what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, Chuck.
Yeah, well, we're going to see how close we can get to that one of these days. I'm pretty sure. All right. Well, let's talk about frameworks. So, Dan,
we need to introduce Uncle Bob first, though.
Yeah. Well, he needs no introduction, but yeah, we did call him out. Bob, is there anything you want people to know about? Are you working on anything coming up?
Oh, hex. Yeah, I just finished a book, and it should be out in time for Christmas, I hope. It's called We Programmers, and it's a history of programmers going back to Charles Babbage and then working forward in time, Grace Hopper and the trio that did C.
I'm so looking forward to this book. You don't know how much I'm looking forward to that book.
I was going to say, come out by Christmas. So are you coming back on in January, please?
Sure. I'm glad to talk about that book.
That stuff is so fascinating.
It was a fun book. That was just a giant entertainment for me.
I would love to know, for example, how you did the research, but I guess we could save it for a future episode. Yeah. I do have, though, one question about it. Do the readers on Amazon confuse you with George Martin?
No one has ever confused me with George Martin.
His books are almost long enough. Bob's are.
Anyway.
I always love talking to Bob. So let's dive into the framework thing. Dan, you're the one that brought this video to me, so I'm going to let you kind of set the stage, and then Bob can defend himself vigorously from our onslaught.
So, to be honest, I don't even know how I found the video. Maybe it just popped up in my timeline. I was watching some of Bob's other talks. And to be honest, it's not really a talk. It's more of a snippet from a talk. I was looking for the full talk, but I just couldn't find it. For some reason, that particular YouTube channel basically sliced up the talk into a lot of little parts. And like Bob said, put some background music behind it to make it more exciting, I guess. But specifically, that particular video was Bob warning the audience against using frameworks. And that's an interesting take in the context of web development these days. Let me put it this way. I don't think I've seen a vanilla JS implementation of something significant in a long time.
Hang on. I just looked up Bob's book on Amazon, and it says it's available now. I'm going to put the link into the comments, and that way people can go and devour it over Christmas. All right, go ahead.
So basically, my opinion is a bit different than Bob's on this, potentially. And interestingly, to some extent, based on Bob's own clean code principles. So I was kind of interested to hear, what he actually thinks of frameworks, even if his definition of frameworks matches what, more or less the way that what we define to be a framework in the context of web development. Like maybe he means something else. So I'm really glad that you've got Bob on. So hi, Bob.
Hi. So I can go into this right now if you'd like.
Yeah, do it.
So
break our hearts.
First of all, the definition of framework. The definition of framework that I'm using here is some piece of software written by someone else that takes a very large amount of control away from you, the programmer. You have to surrender in some way to it. You have to adopt its conventions. You have to integrate with its modules. If it's an object-oriented program, you have to derive from its base classes, that kind of thing. A framework like that requires the programmer to make a very large commitment to the framework. The problem with that is that it's an asymmetric relationship. The framework author makes no commitment at all to those who must commit to them. So there's this very uneven relationship there. The framework author can do anything he wants, or she, whoever this person is, they can do anything they want. They can make a change to the framework in any way they feel like it and drag a whole host of people kicking and screaming along with them because they have bound themselves so tightly to the framework. There is a very famous image of a person whom I have a very high regard for, David Hannemeyer Hansen, who several years ago at a Rails conference, objecting to all of his users' demands against him, put up on the screen two words. The first one starts with F and the second one starts with Y. And that's kind of a good symbol.
That's a very David thing to do.
Well, he is more or less a definition of a benevolent dictator, almost as much as Linus is.
Well, that's the problem, right? You've got a benevolent dictator. And if you go in a way that the dictator doesn't like, you're out in the cold.
So that wasn't the only point you made, but I want to address this particular one. No, you made several points, but I think that was one of the core points that you made. And what you said is obviously true, but it's also true when you consider the programming language you use, when you consider the platform you're running on, when you consider maybe even some of the core libraries that you're using. So no code runs in a vacuum. You're always dependent on something, even the hardware. So how is that really different than any of those other things? Because at the end of the day, your software is going to be running on something.
Well, there's a difference in that. So the asymmetry of the relationship in the case of a framework is greater than the asymmetry when, for example, with a programming language. Let Jarno Strustrup, right, makes the C++ programming language. His success depends on him being able to satisfy a very large number of people, right? At which he's worked very hard at in the C++ Standards Committee until recently, has been doing a great job with that. With a framework,
You know why I'm laughing.
Yeah. It's a pretty open secret.
It's an interesting question why I'm laughing. Well, the word question.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, no.
We're not allowed to say that word anymore. At least
Apparently.
not in the C++ community. Oh, those guys. What a... I'm not going to go into it here. But someone can put up a framework. And in the case of DHH, Rails is a really good example of this. He did that for himself. And for 37 Signal. And then he opened it up to the world and said, hey, guys, you want to use it? That's great, but don't bother me. Okay, that's perfectly fair. On the other hand, if you're the user, caveat emptor, man, you use that at your own risk. If you're using C++, well, that's not quite at your own risk. There's a difference in the relationship there. If you're using a platform like OS X, right, they've got a commitment to you, a small one. But DHH, no commitment to me if I'm using Rails.
Really? I think Apple more or less only has a commitment to their shareholders. I think that's about it.
When you're talking about Swift or their frameworks in particular?
Everything.
Yeah.
Everything that Apple does.
Well,
really.
It's interesting too, right? Because, you bring up David Heinemeier Hansen, but I mean, this is a JavaScript podcast. I can argue both sides of anything with Rails, but it's true. A lot of the stuff that they put into the framework are things that they need for Basecamp or something else, and so that's what goes in. The reality is that they recently formed the Rails Foundation, and they get input from some of them now. But again, a lot of times it's stuff that Shopify needs, and that's stuff that I'm never going to touch. But let's switch gears here for a little bit because, Dan brought up Apple. A lot of the frameworks that a lot of people are using these days are frameworks like React and Angular, which are both sponsored and supported by large companies like Facebook and Google. And they're solving the problems that they have, right? I mean, to a certain degree.
It's actually interesting because I recently heard on a podcast that was on the JS Party, I think, podcast. They interviewed some of the React creators at ReactConf or something like that, the recent React conference. And they said something very interesting, and I think it also appears in the React documentary, which actually is pretty good, and I mostly recommend it. I'm kind of annoyed with them that they didn't mention Wix, but that's an aside. No, we were like the biggest implementation the first big implementation outside Meta, and somehow it's totally missing. But anyway, the point they made actually totally matches what Bob said, which is they created React initially for internal use, and then they thought, hey, it's interesting, so they decided to open source it and let it out, and it was never a profit center for Facebook, so they didn't really care about their users as customers, and they mostly much of their motivation about what to do or not to do in that framework derived from Facebook's own needs. So I'm totally in agreement with Bob about that. That being said, that's actually kind of changing now because a lot of what's driving innovation in the React world is kind of moving from React to Next.js. And Next.js is heavily associated with Vercel, and much of Vercel's business is based on their need for Next.js to be successful. So it's changing now. I mean, it's starting to become a two-way street. And in fact, they actually said on the podcast that they're happy about the fact because they're now driven more by actual customer needs than by whatever somebody just says that should be done within Meta.
So I understand and I agree with everything you just said. But back to Bob's point, and I'm kind of poking things both ways because I'm kind of curious where the balance is, and I haven't made up my mind yet, right? So I kind of want to hear the arguments on both sides. But Meta could right, with the React core team and their ownership over React, decide to do something that people don't want, or decide not to implement features that people do want, and actively work against certain movements within the community should they decide to. Now, I'm not saying they will, and I don't know why they would, but it could happen, right?
But it's open source, and then somebody could theoretically fork it and do whatever they want with it.
Yeah, but most of the other frameworks we're talking about are too.
Well, the big difference is that React is more or less the only really successful framework, maybe also Vue to an extent, probably also Vue. The other frameworks really need to incite or elicit, elicit would be the better word, elicit people to actually use them.
Mm-hmm.
So there, the two-way street is much more active. And I would argue that it's kind of the same thing with programming languages. I mean, once a programming language becomes super mainstream and used widely, a lot of the people who are using it use it really without a choice. Basically, whatever job they got basically said, you need to use language X, you need to use framework Y. But when you're talking about a new programming language or a new framework, that's like the up and coming thing, then you're trying to convince people to use what you're providing, and then it's much more of trying to sell your benefits, I think. Or would you disagree, Bob?
Oh, no, I don't disagree at all. You are trying to sell your benefits, and everybody's trying to do that. That's what all the framework guys are trying to do. So my position on frameworks is that you should be careful with them, right? That you should understand the relationship, understand that it is asymmetric, and weigh the costs and benefits, right? So, for example, it's very easy to get a Ruby on Rails application up and running in a matter of a few days. Just trivial.
Yeah, I get ridiculous amounts of things done with Rails. I get ridiculous amounts of things done with some of the other frameworks I use on the front end. Right.
But then as time goes by and you want to start doing things that the framework doesn't support well, all of a sudden the framework starts to fight against you. And then you're in this funny mode because you've already made this commitment. And now the next thing you want to do is going to get hard. And the one after that is going to be even harder. And you have to violate the framework in ways that it doesn't care about. It didn't make it easy for you, and now you have to subvert it in bizarre ways. So you need to know that going in. One of the problems that I see with frameworks is that they do a great job of selling, just as you're saying, right? They'll do a terrific job, and they'll show you these lovely little applications on a YouTube video or something. Oh, look, you just have to write these 17 lines of code, and life will be glorious for you. And you're not really looking down the road next year when life is not going to be so glorious. So my advice to people is to be careful with frameworks and, to the extent possible, try to isolate yourself from them. Not that you shouldn't use them, but you should use them in a way that is careful so that if the framework turns around and bites you, you've got some options.
So before asking you about how to implement that type of isolation, I'll go one step back and ask you, if I'm in a situation where I can actually get to select the framework that I use rather than having it thrust on me by, the previous developers who worked at the company. Any advice on how I should go about choosing the most appropriate framework for me?
Well, so that gets into the other discussion we were having. How much of the attitude of the authors is geared towards the user community as opposed to their own community? In the case of Rails, that was an interesting one because that just started, I keep going back to Rails, but that just started as a nice little framework for those guys. And then it leaked out into the community and everyone started using it. And that's a bit of a warning sign, right? You look at that and think, well, are they going to take this in some direction that I don't like? On the other hand, if you've got a very large organization and they're trying to keep 100,000 programmers happy and their reputation hangs on that framework,
Like Vercel, for example.
That's a slightly better relationship. You can take a little more confidence in that. And that gets into the programming language argument, right? If they're really trying to, give programmers the language of the internet, well, then they're going to have to keep an awful lot of programmers happy, and it's not quite as risky.
Interesting story, though, is what happened with Angular. Like Angular 1 and 2 kept a lot of developers really happy, and then they kind of broke that contract. And that's when React happened. But React, why are you making a face, Bob?
Well, the face I'm making has nothing to do with Angular or React. It has to do with a meta issue, which is that frameworks are popularity fads. They come and go. This month it's going to be Framework X, but next month somebody's going to say, "Oh, Framework Y is so much better." And so that's another one of these risk factors of a framework. You don't know if the framework you choose is going to be popular next year, or you may have to convert everything over to the next new framework, or all your programmers may quit because they don't like this framework and they want to go to a company where they're using that framework. So we wind up in this very strange popularity contest, which has almost no substance to it. Almost no.
Well, so go ahead, Chuck. Sorry.
So the thing that I'm seeing that both kind of illustrates this but doesn't quite line up with it is I've spoken with a whole bunch of people who still have apps that are running things like Backbone.js, right? And so they want to move into something like React.js, right? But it's not so much the fad cycle that's driving it, so much as just the technology and the standards and things like that are available today and that have been built into React that haven't been maintained into something like Backbone, and there are some very good reasons for that. So what they're looking to switch to is they're looking to switch to something that gives them the advantages that React has because Backbone no longer has them, as opposed to a fad cycle.
I significantly disagree. I think the most significant consideration the developers have when thinking about switching frameworks is their hireability.
No, that's true. But my point is typically the argument they're making is the technological one.
Oh, they might make a technological argument, but the real motivation is I don't want Backbone on my resume. I want React on my resume. That's right. The real reason.
It's true.
That seems so weird to me, though, because it's a sea of mediocrity. I mean, you're fighting against nobody can identify who's a good React developer, right? Like, how would you even interview to find out which React developer is actually good? Because there's so much noise. How do you find the signal in that?
I agree.
That's what seems weird to me.
I agree with what you said, AJ, but that still doesn't change the fact that that a person with React experience on their resume is more hireable than a person without React experience in their resume.
And that's just insane. That's just insane. You don't want to hire programmers based on their familiarity with a framework.
Oh, Bob, everybody does it.
I know.
Everybody does it.
It's insane.
Well, it's more like a meme than it's not like it doesn't seem like a conscious, rational decision. It's like
I'll take it even a step back.
Yeah.
It doesn't even matter if it's true. It matters that the developers picking the framework think that it's true.
Okay. And there's a bunch of HR guys that think it's true too.
Yeah. I think that in the age of AI hiring, where you just have to stuff your resume with a bunch of keywords.
It's so true. It is so true. If you want a resume that's going to get you an interview,
out there that can see through this nonsense. Yeah.
If you want to get an interview, you take the resume you wrote and you hand it off to an AI system and say, I want to get this job, and you have to optimize it because people don't read your resume. They hand it off to an AI system that tells them how good a match you are. And you're cracking up because you could be a crappy developer that has a terrifically optimized resume. It's like SEO for job search.
Yeah, but it just gets you through the door. At the end of the day, I've yet to see a job when there was no actual technical interview.
That's fair, but they're in my opinion, and I think AJ's making this point, they're screening out a bunch of competent, really terrific people who didn't optimize their thing for the AI system.
Oh, that's what happens when the job market is weaker. When the job market is such that developers in high demand and there's not enough supply, then you can get by with whatever crap you happen to have in your resume. But when the situation is reversed, you're absolutely correct. It's SEO for getting a job.
Yeah. Now I want to divert us back to the discussion on the frameworks and whether it's hype or not hype and things like that. I guess the real thing that I'm wondering, and I'm curious to see what you think, Bob. But
wait, but Chuck, I'm sorry, Bob did not answer my question.
Okay, well, I think I'm asking the same question another way, but go ahead.
Well, my question was, how do you pick a framework?
Yeah, that's what I was going to go for. Was if you're looking at these frameworks and it's you're worried about stability, you're worried about the team, whether or not they're going to change stuff, whether or not they're going to implement the things you need, what you're giving up versus what you're getting. Yeah, how do you pick? Or do you?
Well, I mean, you look at the framework technically first to see if it's technically compatible, right? You make sure that it's not just surface compatibility. It's going to help me for the next 2 weeks.
Compatible with what?
Whatever your application is. If you're writing I don't know, some kind of a desktop application or some kind of a handheld application, and you're trying to figure out, is this framework going to help me? How much is it going to help me? Is it just going to help me in the first 2 weeks, or is it going to help me long term? That's one thing to look at. Then the other thing to look at is what's the user base? How many people are using this? Are they putting demands on the framework authors, and are the framework authors meeting those demands? And who are these framework authors anyway? Is it one guy in his basement, or is it a group of people who have made a commitment to the community? Those are the kinds of things you want to be looking at. And then even then, you want to put that framework in your system and isolate yourself from it. As much as you can. It's hard to do, but as much as you can, so that when they screw you, and they will screw you, you will have some options.
So I have a follow-up question on your first point, which is it compatible with your application?
Yeah.
A lot of people that I talk to about their applications, they don't have the depth of understanding of either the framework or the application to make a good call there. So what kinds of questions, like let's say that I'm building, the dream app that does the podcast of all podcasting podcast stuff, right? What kinds of questions do I need to be asking about my app, and what kinds of questions do I need to be asking about the framework so that I can make at least a somewhat informed decision on this, knowing that my requirements may change?
So tell you a story. 20 some odd years ago, my son and I built an application. You're probably aware of it. It's called Fitness. And it's a web-based application, right? So it puts up web pages. And the first decision you would make, the first framework decision you would make if you had to do a web app is, what web server should I use? Okay, well, we didn't use one.
Ouch.
We wrote one. Why did we write a web server? Well, it turns out that a web server is about 300 lines of code. If you get rid of all the crap that the framework is going to put in there that you'd have to carry with you, a nice framework for doing web serving is 300 lines of code. It's almost a trivial piece of work. And so we thought, and this is one of the ways you would do this decision, right? You would look at what the framework gives you, and you'd have to look in some depth. And then you have to ask yourself the question, what would it take for me to write that? And in some cases, it's not a lot. In some cases, it's more. So I'll tell you another story. About 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, I started writing a desktop application for a social network protocol called Nostr. It's one of those federated social networking stuff that nobody can censor. And I had it up on my screen, and I was writing the code. I was writing it all in Clojure. It's lots of fun. And I thought, I'm not using any framework. I'm just going to muscle through this thing. And I picked up one little framework called processing, which is a nice little thing. It doesn't get in your way very much. And I fiddled around with that for a while, and it started to get hard because I had to implement all of the text editing stuff and all of the double clicking and all that drag and drop crud. And I thought, I really need a framework. So I said, okay, I'm going to use a good old standard, Swing. Well, that was the worst decision I ever made in my life, let me tell you. I think
you're going to get some sympathy on this podcast saying that. But
I started integrating Swing into this thing, and I got it. It's up and running. It works. It's fine. It's just a hellhole. It's awful. And I'm thinking now what I need to do is just rewrite the whole thing. There's two different stories with two different outcomes, right? I thought, I can probably make it with Swing. It's old. It's reliable. Lots of people have used it. No, it's a nightmare. So
go ahead, Dan.
No, go ahead. You go ahead, AJ. My questions tend to be long.
The question I want to pose is, what is the alternative to a framework then? Because the reason people choose frameworks, they want a shortcut. They want some layer of abstraction that
gives you good
hides
tools
away problem stuff.
Sure.
So what's the alternative to a framework? Because I don't think that you just write everything by hand.
Well, sometimes the alternative is to do it by hand. Sometimes, right? Sometimes the benefit that the framework offers you appears large, but is actually not. And that was the case with fitness, right? The very idea that we would write our own web server had us going, oh my God, we'd have to. And then we actually wrote the thing. 300 lines of code. I can get stuff on a website pretty doggone easy. It's a little bit of socket manipulation. So that's one case where you overestimate the value of the framework compared to the effort to do it yourself. Then the Noster one that I did, that's the opposite case where I underestimated the value of a framework. And in the end, I decided I had to have one, and then I chose the wrong one. Right? So there's no way out of this dilemma. We don't want to write everything from scratch. We do want to use what people have done. We want to build on the good work of others. But it's not a free lunch. You have to be really careful about the frameworks you use. You don't want that decision to be a quickie. You don't want it to be one based on popularity. You don't want to do it because all your friends are doing it. You want to look at it good and hard, and you want to do some of the experiments. How far can I get without the framework?
So you, in one of your talks, it might have been this one, you mentioned that in one of your projects, I think it was you, pretty sure that it was you deferred the database decision to the very end of the project.
Yep.
Unfortunately, from my experience, that's not really something that you can do with a framework. And the problem is that you kind of need to choose a framework more or less up front. And when you do that, like you said about that database selection, you have the least amount of information. So unless you happen to be rewriting an existing app, which, is done, but is fairly rare in our industry for good or bad, you are making the decision about the framework while you have the least amount of information about what you're actually developing.
So what can you do to get more information before you make the framework decision? So, for example, most of the frameworks out there are some kind of UI framework. They help you manage the user interface, React, Angular, all these things, right? It's all some way for all the little gestures on the user interface to make sense. What if you did not do the UI first? What if you focused on business rules first? What if you wrote the core of the application without a user interface so that you had information about what this application actually does? And then you can back away from that and say, okay, what kind of user interface do I really need? What features are really going to be necessary here? And you can make an informed decision about what kind of framework you're going to need.
Yeah, except that most product managers start with Figma.
Well, yeah, there's a problem for you.
I was going to make the joke that if everybody follows Bob's methodology here, no one would use React. But
well, I'm actually not sure.
I think a lot of people would opt for not something so heavy on the front end.
I'll put it differently, though. So in the past, when people asked me, we spoke about Quora before the recording started. I once answered a question of, frameworks, what are they good for on Quora? And back in the day, back when I wrote that answer several years ago, what I said was that at the end of the day, most web applications do more or less the same thing. We all like to think that we're very original, but at the end of the day, like a significant portion of what we develop is more or less the same as what everybody else does. It's like, filling forms, posting forms, stuff like that. And therefore, it's kind of repetitive to write it again and again from scratch. And frameworks, like you said, like provide a box solution that does a lot of the heavy lifting for you, that you don't need to repeat yourself. And that's true, and I still think that's true. But my focus on what the frameworks provide has kind of shifted since then, because I've been interacting a lot with a lot of framework creators and designers. So Ryan Carniato is a friend, Mishko Havery is a friend. So I've been thinking about what it is that they're thinking. Like when they explain to me their considerations and their design decisions, what I came to the conclusion is that the core difference between the frameworks is actually the mental model that they promote. And the different frameworks, like React versus Solid versus Svelte versus Vue versus Angular, all have really different mental models of how applications in general and user interfaces in particular should be architected. And consequently, to a great extent, ideally, when you choose a framework, I think you should choose the framework that best matches your own particular mental model.
Now, how do you determine that mental model if you don't understand the details of the application? If you're working on a particular kind of application and you focus on the business rules, you may come to a very different decision about the mental model that you need for your user interface. If you've chosen a framework up front, that framework will drive you into a mental model that will then have incompatibility with the business rules themselves, or at least the ideal state of those business rules. This is the old argument of, do you go inside out or do you go outside in? And I like going inside out.
For sure. And I totally agree with what you're saying. I'm just thinking that understanding the mental model or even the philosophy of a framework requires less initial investment than what most people might expect. That even if you can develop a fairly simple sample application, like a throwaway application, in order to kind of gauge the framework's philosophy and mental model and see not necessarily if it fits your needs in the context of that particular application you want to implement, but rather your own personal preferences in general. And I would contend that your personal preferences supersede like the details of a particular application.
That one makes me a little nervous. First of all, you're probably working in a team. I mean, some of us don't, but probably you're working in a team, and everybody's going to have their own, mental model preferences. I would hope that the application would focus that, and that you could have a reasonable debate about, okay, what of our mental rules, which one of our mental models is most applicable to this particular application? I would hope.
Yeah, you're correct. But at the end of the day, there's a person. At the end of the day, it's a person that makes the decision.
Yeah.
And everybody else kind of has to live with it.
The benevolent dictator arises again, yes.
Yeah, but it might just be the first person on the team. The original developer on the project.
If there was only one, yes. Mm-hmm.
So, well, in a lot of startups, there usually is one. I've worked at various, large organizations where I ask, why are we using technology X? And the answer is, this guy who worked here 8 years ago, that's what he chose.
Yeah. I have joined startups and thrown away the work of the early developers.
I did this on a
way to go forward.
Part of our test framework on the project I'm working on for a client literally on Friday. Why are we doing it this way? Well, the other developer couldn't figure out how to do it the normal way. I figured out how to do it the normal way.
Now, another story, and this was a long, long time ago. I was working at a startup, and we needed to store a bunch of data on disk, and of course, everybody says, well, you've got to get a relational database. This was like 1985, right? You've got to get a relational database. And I thought, we don't need a relational database. All we need to do is store a couple of things on disk, and that's fairly easy. And we did. We just stored a real simple little thing that we cobbled together. Along comes the marketing guy who joined the company about 6 months later. You don't have a relational database in your system? Yeah, that's right. We don't need it. Well, we can't even sell it if you don't have a relational database in your system. It was the most absurd argument to make to a bunch of technical people that the marketing guy said he could not sell the application if it did not have a relational database in it. And in the end, they had to put a relational database into it because the marketing guy was absolutely adamant and overrode all the technical people. I didn't stay at that company.
Well, hang on, Bob. So what you're saying is if the framework doesn't implement AI and blockchain, then it's worthless.
I just want to mention that a few years ago we had Noam Honing on the show talking about their kind of framework called Remote. It's not a UI framework; it's more of a database or something like database connectivity layer that can work either from the back end or from the front end. And interestingly, when you install their thing, it comes with a built-in flat file-based implementation. That because they don't know what database you're going to use, and but they want you to be able to play with it out of the box.
Right.
And what he told me at least, that in a lot of cases companies just stick with their flat file base.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because it works, and for the amounts of data that they might have, it might be good enough. Interesting. But the point I'm trying to make is this. So, for example, let's consider React. And the reality, interestingly, a lot of people who are using React are not actually aware or sufficiently cognizant of the React way. And when they develop using React, they don't actually develop according to the way in which the React designers intended them to actually work.
They don't even do this on their documentation, by the way. Because there is the document, the React rationale or whatever it is, and that's where things bugs me, is the documentation goes against their own principles, because they give examples to give the examples in the fewest lines rather than to give examples that follow the patterns that they are prescribing people use.
Anyway, what I'm trying to say, so React, for example, is very much about the ideal of state in, UI out, like UI as stateless functions. And, you can debate about how well they've been able to achieve it and some of the caveats that they have. and so on and so forth, because at the end of the day, UI just can't be totally pure functions. And but that's kind of the React way. And if you choose React, that needs to be kind of your design philosophy. And people ask, like, why doesn't React have signals? And we had the people from React. We had Joe Savona from React, from the React core team, on the show, and he basically said, because that's not React. That is contradictory to the React philosophy. On the other hand, if you want signals, then you've got Solid, or now you've got Svelte. So really, you can create a fairly small application and see, do I like the React way, or do I like the Solid way? And if you actually start by thinking about what is the core philosophy of this framework and work from there, my assertion is that you'll probably make a better decision than trying to go based off of your not yet fully formed understanding of what your application is going to be and what exactly it's going to need.
I'm not going to disagree with that. I think the more experience you have with frameworks, the better information you're going to have to make a decision.
The problem, though, is you said to separate as much of the business logic out of the framework itself. I guess that means that if you've got some sort of business logic, encapsulate it in some pure function, and then you can call that function, get the values, and you don't really care what you're calling it from. The problem is that, from what I've seen in reality, is that frameworks tend to seep into those functions. You look at what should have been a pure function without any framework code, and then all of a sudden you find a lot of framework-related code in it.
You're making my argument for me.
Earlier, you were saying that basically people ought to discover their business rules and then go into the UI afterwards. And I think in industry, that's very rare. It's kind of like the waterfall development got rebranded as agile. So you see the same, charts in the, 12-month timeline, but it's agile now. I think it's really, really dangerous to start with the design and try to work backwards, because you would need to start with what business problem are you trying to solve and then move forwards from there. I wish that every application, the engineers created the super ugly prototype first so that the designers knew what they had to work with.
So the alternate to that is you take an application with really significant business rules. So, for example, some kind of insurance application. And there's just a lot of number crunching that you're going to have to do, and a lot of data lookups and all kinds of stuff with a relatively simple amount of incoming information. And the temptation there would be to show a nice little desktop app and oh, here's the form, and look, you click on these things, and isn't it wonderful? And everybody's applauding. And then you actually have to write the business rules, and the business rules, it turns out, completely thwart that whole idea of the user interface. Right? So, wait a minute, we can't do it that way. We got to do it a completely different way. It would be, in my view, it would be better to start inside, get some feel for what the business rules look like, and then you can start to project outwards. You don't have to finish all the business rules, but you can start to project outwards that way, as long as you've got some idea of how you're going to manipulate all this data that's going to be on the screen.
So
now, sometimes it's trivial. Sometimes there's just nothing to do with the data. It goes into a database, comes out of a database, nothing else, and you've got a CRUD application. And okay, if all you've got is a CRUD application, you can probably make the framework decision pretty early.
So do you have any suggestions for, because most people, we're just peons, right? We just, we there's some sort of project manager and they're making all those decisions. How do you, if you've got this great wisdom, which it's like product managers, I don't think that they learn that, right? How do you communicate that upstream to say, hey, to develop the best product?
You're triggering me, AJ. You're triggering me. I've worked in those salt mines before.
But that's like most of the salt mines, though, is it not? I mean,
it's true. You have the not technical, non-expert people making these deep decisions on how you put your app together.
So, but what's a solution, or what's a way to bring some of this knowledge forward to help the development process? Because I think many people have been on a team where their intuition says, hey, this doesn't seem right. Maybe they don't feel like they've got the confidence to speak up because obvious people above them must know what they're doing or something.
So
I believe in miracles.
I do want to say two things about this though. So like there are two problems that I can see with I'm just developing my APIs first. We'll invoke them from curl, and once we see those work, we'll start building the UI. The two problems are A, how are you going to raise money that way? Like
the AI generate the commercial, and then you just build whatever you're going to build. I mean, it's been that way for decades. When was the last time that a company that was raising money had a product?
Well, it had a demo of a product though.
Demo. It was like Wizard of Ozzy, or it was like completely done by a 3D animator.
The other problem, but the more serious issue though is that I'm kind of wary of UIs that are built without any consideration for how they're ultimately going to be used.
Yeah.
Because then you try to build a user interface on top of them and you discover that they just don't actually fit your needs. They work great from the command line, but they're not really appropriate for the UI where we need to support drag and drop and I don't know what. So
I think that people should create UIs, just dumb ones that are ugly to start with, that have the benefits there. Like okay, it's like I've said before about suck-driven development. You don't need to produce the most complete project with the most features. And there's an excellent Y Combinator series I'll link to in the pics about this. You need to produce the product that does one thing significantly better than all the other products on the market. And you can do that with really bad UI in terms of a test cycle, like true agile, right? Like you do the development sprint, you do the design sprint, and then so on.
On the other hand, Apple conquered the world with building amazing UIs on top of products that in many cases did not provide features that were not available somewhere else before with not as great UI.
I think you're making an earlier point that Bob pointed out, just maybe in a different way, and that is you have to understand your application and what matters. Because I believe that there are situations where the functionality and the way that things kind of bolt together and work matters more than how pretty your UI is. But in other cases, the UI not looking great. Just to give an example, I'm part of an organization. I'm in leadership in this organization. And, we were looking for a solution to help get people to collaborate. And the more we talked about it, the more it just looked and sounded and felt like Discord. But I'm not the ultimate leader, right? I'm part of leadership, but I'm not the one that makes the ultimate call. And Telegram actually, but the issue was that the person that made the ultimate decision, she took one look at the way that Discord is designed and said, this looks like a video game platform. No one's going to use it. And so in that case, it mattered. But in other cases, having the functionality and having people being willing to say, this doesn't look like what I want it to look like, but it does all the things I want it to do, you can do. And so you have to understand your application. I guess part of understanding your application is also understanding the limitations and trade-offs that your users are willing to make.
So the Apple story is a really interesting one. Because if you go all the way back to the Macintosh, right, 1983, was that?
Two? I think 82.
Something like good long time ago. When that machine came out, it was absolute magic. And I had to have one. Everybody had to have one. and you could do Mac Paint, you could do Mac Write, you could do Mac Draw. They had all these applications that nobody had ever seen anything like this before. And they conquered the world with that UI. Even Microsoft finally had to bow and go, okay, yeah, Windows is great. Okay, so how did that happen? And that happened through a series of experiments and iterations that mostly failed, right? And a lot of it happened at Xerox a few years before. Right?
Xerox PARC.
K mecking around with the Dynabook, and then eventually they come up with the Smalltalk browser, which, they really had it kind of, but not quite. And then they came up with the Xerox Star, one of the early word processors back in the day. And Apple said, ooh, I'm going to steal that. Steve Jobs literally stole it. So, okay, I'm going to steal it.
I would say that Xerox literally gave it to him, but,
they gave away everything. Xerox PARC gave away everything. Just a remarkable story in all of this gold that came out of Xerox PARC that the Xerox company just apparently had no interest in. And just gave it away to everybody.
Did you see that movie, which wasn't so great? I think it's called Fire in the Valley or something like that,
No.
where they have this amazing scene there where the people from the West Coast, from Xerox PARC, come to the Xerox main office in New York, and there's this huge desk with all the CEO and all the VPs and whatnot sitting there all in their suits, and on the other end you've got the guys in their t-shirts and their beards, and there's this amazing scene where the CEO of Xerox picks up a mouse by the cord, and he's holding it like a dead mouse, and he says it. He goes, "You want us to sell something called a mouse?" They just didn't get it. It was the culture was just too divergent, I guess. And then they gave it all away to Steve Jobs, who basically heard about them, and they literally told the head of PARC to just show him around, and he can look at whatever he wants.
That wasn't the only thing Xerox PARC gave away. They gave away just tons of stuff. But then Jobs takes it into Apple, and their first product is the Lisa, which is another failure, right? They couldn't quite get the idea that pixels ought to be square. But they did make a great decision early on, which was the one-button mouse, right? Xerox had the three-button mouse. Apple said, no, it should be one button. There were some very interesting decisions made that led finally to the Macintosh, and then the rollout of these very interesting user interfaces. But it was not a burst of insight, right? It came through a whole bunch of iterations, mostly failed iterations.
If I'm dragging us back to frameworks, though, the current well,
I was thinking about doing the same thing, but I'm so fascinated by where this has gone.
No, I know, but I do want to cover. So the reality is that for the past 14 years, it seems that React rules the framework, the front-end framework world, and that it's not going away. It's the default. It's the safe choice. It's like you never get fired for buying IBM kind of a choice now these days. It's literally no choice at all. And I'm looking at some of the other frameworks that have amazing ideas, again, the Svelte or Solid or Quick, and they're unable to break through. Like the latest statistics that I've seen on the Google Crux website, which kind of analyzes websites that Google indexes, it looks like React is like all the other frameworks. It's more than all the other frameworks put together. Second place is Vue, and then all the rest are just like minuscule in comparison. So we can talk about developers needing to think about picking the correct framework all day long. At the end of the day, they're just going to pick React.
Okay. Be wise.
We could talk about whether or not people should build their website or not, but all day long they're just going to pick WordPress. Right. I mean, like the things that React is capturing are not the things that are going to be unique and driving lots of value, right? Like if there is no significant benefit to something else and React is fine, then React is fine. If there is something where there's a new type of value, where there's going to be new value driven in a significant way, people are going to pick something else that matches where that value is. But in the same way that if you were to compare React to WordPress, you'd say, oh, well, React just really isn't gaining any steam. But React is a completely different use case than what WordPress is. And I think the same is every layer of the industry, right? You could look at it from Wix and WordPress and React and, take it down the pipe. Where there's more unique value, people are going to make more unique choices. Where there's less unique value, people are going to make less unique choices.
So this kind of begs the question, and I'm curious, AJ, what you think and what Bob thinks. Well, I'm curious what Dan thinks too. But you're making the point is it a problem that we necessarily have one sort of 800-pound gorilla that takes over the most of the market? Or, does that stifle some of the innovation that's going to go on out there? Or is it more in the realm of kind of what AJ's putting out there, where maybe the people with these unique use cases will pick something else anyway, and so it doesn't matter?
Of course it's going to stifle innovation. Like, by
right.
definition.
That's my instinct.
But is WordPress stifling innovation?
I don't... That's an interesting question. I would argue that the use case is different. The use case for WordPress is basically somebody wants to have these days is somebody wants to have a simple web presence as quickly and as cheaply and ideally as reliably as possible, and not really and hopefully not think about it at all. Web development is actual development. I would argue that
they're trying to bring it to the level of GPT, right? They're trying to get rid of the developer and say, you're not going to have a job. GPT is going to do it for you. React's going to be...
WP GPT, what do you think, Bob?
Oh, you mean ChatGPT taking... I've been writing an awful lot of code here. I've been doing the advent of code exercises. Every December they do that. And I'm doing them all in Clojure, and I've got my IDE set up with GitHub Copilot. And it's really quite remarkable what that thing puts up on my screen. Half of it more than half of it I have to throw away. But every once in a while, it's like, oh yeah, I figured that one out pretty well. So I think there's some interesting stuff there. I have no fear at all that anyone's job is going to be taken away by a large language model that has been suffused with code. I don't.
I want to back up though. What do you feel like we gain or lose by having a kind of a dominant player in the framework market?
That's the VHS versus Betamax argument, right? Okay, so VHS is going to dominate for a while until the CDs come out. When is this model of application going to change? Right now
it's a matter of time.
That's an interesting question, because the core thing is that in the web world, we are kind of tied to JavaScript and the DOM. So because the platform isn't changing, that reduces the need of whatever we implement on top of the platform to change. Now, if I don't know what happens. Like if we all go AR, VR, then I don't know. There might be a need to change that. I'm not sure, to be honest. But I like in a talk I gave like 15 years ago, I said that I'm annoyed with the fact that laptops are still the dominant form factor. And you know what? 15 years later, laptops for developers are still the dominant, or for work, are still the dominant form factor. So where's the thing that replaces the laptops? It's not here. So we are on top of the web. We are on top of the DOM. We don't want to use the DOM as is, and we can debate about why that is. You know what? Do you think people should be I don't know if you're the one to ask this question specifically, but do you think people should forego frameworks and just use JavaScript and the DOM instead?
Oh, no, that would be silly. Right. You're going to have to get them. You just have to be careful. That's all. But yeah, you're going to want to have some kind of framework assistance because those problems have been solved 80 times by people who know a lot more than you.
Okay, but then the question is, you've got the Reacts and Angulars and Vues that do a lot more than solve some of those problems, right? And then you've got like Alpine or jQuery did some of this, or I've been using Stimulus, right, where it just solves some of the more fundamental issues, and then you wind up using the DOM APIs, and so there's a sliding scale even there, right?
Well, first of all, there's a question of, again, I kind of hinted toward that at the beginning of what is a framework. Like, is React a framework? Is Angular a framework? Is Next.js a framework? They're kind of really different from one another in what they provide. And
they're hostile takeovers of my UI is what they are.
Well, and your idea about the mental model is a good definition of a framework. Does it impose a mental model on you? And frameworks do that.
In that regard, they all are, but to a varying degree.
Yeah.
Right.
Like for example, Next.js also tries to impose a certain mental model on how you implement the backend, which React in and of itself does not. So it's kind of a question to the extent to which it invades or your entire stack, as it were.
Well, that's what I was probing for earlier when I was saying what's the what's the opposite of a framework, or what's the alternative choice? Because the way that I would describe a framework is something where you put your code in the framework, like you implement the abstract class of the framework, whereas a library would be something where you use the library, like your code is on top and the library's in the middle, whereas the framework is the
shell.
Master control, and your code is the little functions that fill out the gaps.
I would argue that at the end of the day, if it's not going to be the framework, then it's going to be the platform that does it for you. So at the end of the day, you are using some sort of framework. And if you think you're not, what I've seen happen is, and I'm kind of quoting Tejas, who we've had on the show several times to talk about similar topics, is that if you don't use a framework, you end up implementing your own framework, and it will likely be worse.
Yep, that's the old argument, right? That every application eventually implements some bad version of Lisp.
Yeah, but the thing is again, it's going back to the argument of,
and it's doubly true for JavaScript, by the way. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt.
True, JavaScript, Lisp. But my point is that if you have a really, really simple application, and it's a fairly well understood system, and you can get away with using the DOM APIs on it, and that's it, right? And it's not going to grow in complexity or its needs. It's not a common use case, but my point is you can get away in a lot of cases with not having the framework, or having a framework as we talk about it on the front end, as opposed to the more complicated things where you need some of these problems solved.
So the core question you need to ask these days in front-end world, in front-end web dev world, is, do I really need this to be a single-page application? If the answer is yes, because sometimes you do, then you probably have to be using a framework. If the answer is no, if the answer is it can be a multi-page application, then you're correct that there's a good chance that you either don't really need a framework, or you can use a fairly minimalistic framework, or you can segregate the framework use to very specific parts. The reality, though, is that for some reason or reasons, it might have to do with what boot camps are teaching. It might have to do with what VCs like to invest in. Whatever it might have to do with what developers like to have in their resume. The reality is that these days, a lot of web apps are being built as single-page applications, whether they need to be or not. I had hoped that something like Astro would reverse that trend, but it doesn't seem to be the case.
So what fascinates me about that, Dan, is the vocabulary that we've all been using now. We've all mentioned the DOM. We've all mentioned JavaScript. And you started mentioning single-page applications as though that were some kind of fundamental constraint. Why are we using that vocabulary? The web has imposed these vocabularies on us that create a mental model of how applications ought to be. And I wonder if we aren't on the verge of leaving that mental model.
I remember an interesting thing. I've tried to look for it. It's an old video that I watched probably 15 or something years ago. I've tried to search for it on YouTube. I can't seem to find it. It's a video of Alan Kay, who I really admire. And apparently he got really annoyed with the web when the web was gaining a lot of popularity and he tried to build an alternative to the web using, well, surprise, surprise, Smalltalk. And it had agents communicating with each other, sending Smalltalk snippets, and and the code would propagate where it needed to go. It was really beautiful. And the way that he demoed it is he built the same application using web technologies. And I'm talking about the web technologies from something like 15 or maybe even 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And he built the same application using his own platform. And he achieved parity in terms of functionality. And then he ran them both on his laptop and measured the temperature of the laptop. and he showed that the web was running very hot, whereas his application was running really cold.
It's all that HTML parsing.
Yeah, exactly. And guess what? I'm sure, given knowing Alan Kay and what he is and what he's done and everything, and we were talking about Xerox PARC and whatnot, I'm sure that his solution was beautiful. But look what's won. And I considered the web to be the modern web to be one of the greatest achievements of humankind, despite its inefficiencies. So yes, it has created a vocabulary for developers, but the same was true for Unix and for C and C++ and for Windows and all the various platforms that we've had over the years, and for mobile platforms these days. We didn't talk about apps before the mobile platforms. And the App Store. Yeah. The abomination that is the App Store.
Well, the other thing is that I guess the point you're making is that the metric we use to talk about how good something is not processor temperature, right? I mean, there were other things that people wanted from the web, and that's why we got what we got. The other thing, though, is that as things have innovated, a lot of those things have changed, right? The web has become more efficient, or at least in a lot of ways it has.
Has it? I think
in some ways it has. I mean, it's gotten faster and easier to use. I don't know about if you measure the temperature of your.
No, I mean, if you measure the website's loading times, have they gotten faster? Really?
Now we have to load 10 megabytes of JavaScript to get anything done.
Yeah.
They've only seemed to be getting faster since Google kind of, put their whip over the developer's head and started measuring it and telling the developers that it's a ranking factor and whatnot. Then it kind of started to improve. But at the end of the day, the C++ developers who are creating the browsers have done more for web performance than all the JavaScript developers put together.
And that's my point, is that it's the whole of the platform, not necessarily that we're writing better JavaScript or better HTML or whatever.
You're not writing better HTML.
Right. That's my point. But the browser's faster. My machine's faster.
I'm writing better HTML.
I'm sure you are.
Put in brackets.
And the cool thing is that HTML itself is actually getting better. We've got things like pop-ups built in to the HTML that like for years we didn't have it.
Nobody knows about it though. That's another discussion for another day.
Oh, it makes me shiver.
Are you developing for the web these days, Bob?
I try to avoid it when I can. I've got a website that I maintain, and that's really simple raw HTML. I wrote it all in Clojure. I've got a little very simple framework that I use.
So if you need to create,
I try to avoid web development if I can.
So if you need to create an interface for something, what do you use?
An interface for,
like if you're creating a user-facing application, one that can't just be a CLI, what do you use?
So one of the tools that I've been using lately is a very simple library. It's a graphics library called Processing. And it runs in JavaScript. It runs in Java. There's a Clojure shim on top of it that I like to use. And it allows me to build applications, run them on my laptop without worrying about JavaScript, and then compile them into ClojureScript and run them on the web. And that's fairly straightforward. Now, the problem with it is that it doesn't give me all the lovely forms and text capabilities. It's very similar to a graphics library without a lot of text editing. And so I don't typically do a lot of text editing. I can draw nice and pretty pictures. I can do interactive games that way. It's very easy. And I try to avoid all of the more traditional web-based work. Nowadays, I don't really have to do much of that.
Cool.
Yeah. Well, there's a little lull here. Is there anything else we want to tackle here or talk about?
I could just talk with Bob forever, but
Right. Well, I really want to do the history of programming thing, and I want to read the book. So we'll have to have you back.
Okay.
Maybe after the holiday. And
you when mentioning that book, I think you have on the cover. It says something like from ADA to what was to AI.
Yeah.
And you joked that Amazon, because it's a programming book, assumed that you were talking about ADA, the programming language. The funny thing is, when I saw the title, I initially assumed you were talking about the programming language as well. And I was thinking, hey, the ADA programming language is not that old, So, yeah, it took me a minute to realize that you were actually talking about Ada Lovelace.
Yes.
Yeah. Good deal. You want to give us a quick pitch on the book? Just let people know what they're getting if they go buy it.
It is a history of programmers from Babbage all the way up to Dennis Ritchie and Ken Thompson. That's the first part of the book. And I picked a few very interesting characters. So there's everybody, you got to do Babbage. And I did the guys who did Simula, Christian Nygaard and Ola Johan Dahl, and I did Dijkstra because you got to do Dijkstra, and several others along the way. But the focus is technical. This is a book for programmers, right? So I talk about the machines at the bit level. I talk about the way they wrote their code. I give examples of the code. There's pictures of the machines and why the machines were built the way they were built. Talk about the memory technologies and the computation technologies. So it's not a layman's book. This is a technical description so that programmers today can identify with what these guys were doing because it was pretty cool. And so that's the first part of the book, just that. Then the second part of the book is it's where I step into the book at that point, and it is essentially my history. It's almost autobiographical, except that I focus only on the technologies, or almost only on the technologies that I saw from starting in the late 70s going on into 2010 or so. And then the last part of the book is just fantasy. That's me saying, well, gee, what's going to happen in the next 20 years? Which is why I could put AI in the title.
I don't know if you put him in the book, but an amazing character in the early days of computation was von Neumann.
Von Neumann has his own chapter.
Oh, okay, cool.
Oh, yeah. Von Neumann, Turing, von Neumann, and David, can't remember the mathematician's name.
The one that came up with lambda calculus?
Hilbert. David Hilbert.
Oh, David Hilbert. Hilbert space.
Yeah, the three of them share a chapter with each other.
Oh,
Hilbert, Turing, and von Neumann.
Yeah.
Oh, I have to have this book now.
Yeah, me too.
And all of it from those earliest days was driven by war. We have computers today because of war.
Well, most of human innovation is because of war. We don't like to think about it. We all want peace, but at the end of the day, we have penicillin thanks to war.
Mm-hmm.
Most of human innovation is because of war.
Well, let's face it. I mean, wars are won by technology. I mean, even back to, I can ride up on a horse and do worse things to you than you can do to me. Technology won wars. So,
germs and steel. Yeah.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah, even though that book has fallen out of favor, by the way.
What, Jared Diamond's book?
Yep.
Guns, Germs, and Steel. It's great.
Yeah. It's a great book, but people don't prescribe to those theories as much as they did. Turns out that some contradicting evidence was since it's a pretty old book. Let's put it this way.
It is, yeah.
So it's showing its age in terms of research.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Not my area of expertise, but I've read.
Yeah. Well, in putting up a risk, I guess, of throwing something out that I would normally put into a pick. But if you go listen to Hardcore History by Dan Carlin, I mean, a lot of it where he breaks down different wars and war periods. I mean, he basically explains this technology helped these guys win the war, right? And it was, sometimes it was just a marginal difference, but it was enough that it really tipped the scales. So anyway,
yep.
I'm going to roll us right into the picks and then we'll wrap up. AJ, do you want to start us with picks?
All right. So I mentioned earlier, there's a series from Y Combinator from 2014 called How to Start a Startup. And I just think that anybody who works in development and sees it as a craft should watch the whole series. I think it's really valuable to understand business perspective, and especially anybody that's a product manager. If you've not watched this series, you're one of the reasons that Chuck and I cry at night. Like, I'm not, I don't necessarily think that Y Combinator is the greatest, but when they put this series together, they pulled from a seemingly diverse group of people in terms of their, businesses and whatnot. But the principles, you can find them referenced in many other books. There's lots of little, catchphrases sort of things, like little one-line ringers that are really, really good sprinkled throughout the series. And I think that it is a rare instance of really good, really valuable material that I guess was intended to generate some hype around Y Combinator or something, but ended up being not hypey material. It's actually really valuable material. So I'm going to put a link to that. And I just think everybody ought to avail themselves to this. There's very few things in there that I disagree with. I think that it's really, really high value stuff. The other is we got the Dune 2 film collection Of course, my wife did not like the ending of Dune 2, but she did like Dune 2, and she's trying to get one of her girlfriends to watch it, and that's going over her like I forget what the idiom is for when something's not going over well, but
My wife will not watch sci-fi or fantasy TV shows or movies.
Generally, mine won't either. Dune, I was just like, honey, you're probably not going to like it, but will you watch this with me? And she's like, okay. And then she's riveted by it.
Yeah. The closest my wife has come, I think, was the movie Gravity.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that was a very emotional. That kind of had a chick flick feel to it.
Oh.
Is Gravity the one I'm thinking of?
No, well, chick flick? I don't think so.
Oh, no, I'm thinking of Interstellar. Because that one's all about the relationships and everything, and it's kind of like a rival.
Gravity does have a strong female lead character, but she's interesting. Let's put it this way. So, okay.
All right.
She's not a Mary Sue or whatever the colloquial term for uninteresting, strong lead female characters is. It's
gotcha.
And then the last thing I'll pick is I got a new hat, and my wife says I look really good in a hat.
It's beautiful. I love it.
And I was actually inspired by Elon. I saw him wearing it, and I thought, I'll get one. Actually, but the thing is, I'm just really glad we're back in a timeline where people can be honest again. And some of that, BSing, pretending to believe something that you don't believe to appease somebody else. Like, I'm glad we get to relax a little bit from that. And it's been really great to just be able to wear my new hat around and get some compliments and then, get some dirty looks too occasionally. But, it's just nice to be like, I'm safe. Like, America is a safer place again. You are safer to believe what you believe, and just like freedom of speech, I feel so much better now. A lot of anxiety lifted.
It's interesting from somebody looking from the outside on the whole thing. As an Israeli, it's interesting to see a lot of similarities because there's a very, very significant political divide in Israel right now. Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of similarities, but there are also a lot of differences. Like a lot of the issues that are, really almost tearing America's society apart are literally non-issues in Israel. I think we discussed this in the past, Chuck.
Yeah, we've talked about it some. I don't think we've done as much of it on the show, and fair enough, that's not what the show's about. But yeah, it's always interesting to kind of see. It's also interesting to see what filters through, right? What you're hearing about us in Israel and what we're hearing about you here, and then as we talk about it, I find out that you're seeing things completely differently about your situation there and about our situation there, and so anyway,
yeah,
I love having the conversations with people.
Yeah, also definitions like, what's right, what's left are very different between different countries.
Yes. Yep, absolutely. And if there's anything that I can just throw out there in relation to what AJ's saying is I love talking to people about this stuff, right? Whether you agree with me or not. By the way, I have a hat that looks a lot like AJ's, except it's red, and I got it way back in the day. I actually took a picture of myself in it on Twitter, and that got me into trouble. But anyway.
So now we're going to get into trouble because we're on Twitter.
Yeah.
Although Twitter is different. I guess.
But see, that's
all the people that you guys are upsetting right now are on Blue Sky.
On Blue Sky anyway. Yeah. Yeah. I guess my point is though.
Blue Sky.
But I don't really want to upset anybody. Like I just like, it's just, it's been several years of a certain group of people can say whatever they want and wear whatever they want and fly whatever they, and if you say, hey, I'm not really as comfortable with that, then, you're an infidel. And it's nice to be back in a society where it's more two-sided, where we can both say, hey, I don't agree with that, but That's okay. You do you. And somebody else can say, I don't agree with that, but it's okay. You do you. That's where I want to be.
And here's one of the key differences, that when you say infidel in this part of the world, that has a lot of connotation going on with it.
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other thing, though, if we're going to discuss this here, is I hear people basically say, well, you voted for Trump or you voted for Harris because of X or Y. And the reality is I talk to people, and there are a whole bunch of people I talk to that have the one or two issues they care about. And so they voted based on those. And so all of the other things that get thrown at people who voted that way just are not applicable. And it doesn't make a lot of sense to lump people into that basket of thinking one way or the other. And then in other cases, there is a bunch of groupthink around certain ideas that drive another group of people. And so for me, the fascinating thing is talking to people and really understanding why. Why do you care about this? Why are you involved with it? And what's driving your worldview so that you're doing what you're doing? Because that's where you get to real people.
People choose political parties like they choose frameworks.
Sometimes. A lot of times. You're right. I thought you were going to say something
any investigation or understanding whether or not it aligns with their values?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Mostly they're either going according to what their dad voted or intentionally the opposite of what their dad voted.
There's some truth to that. All right, Dan, what are your picks?
So I've really got two picks. First of all, both of them non-political. The first NBA season has started, and I'm really happy about that. It's kind of challenging in Israel because the games are really late at night, so usually we don't get up for them. Instead, we record them and then try not to find out the results and watch them during the day. The benefit being that we can speed through the timeouts and stuff like that. But I'm enjoying myself a lot thanks to the NBA. So that would be my first pick. And my second pick is a TV show on, actually, I'm not sure where it's airing. It's a British television series. Wherever you can get it, I recommend watching it. It's called The Day of the Jackal. It's based on the book Day of the Jackal and the film Day of the Jackal. So maybe I should kind of go back and say that if you've not watched the movie Day of the Jackal from back in the 70s, you should. It's an amazing, excellent movie. But the TV show, the modern TV show is pretty good as well. And so I recommend watching that too. Being that it's a TV series rather than a movie, they can kind of take their time with it, which is, both an advantage and a disadvantage, I guess. But we enjoyed it. So, and it's not science fiction, so my wife would watch it.
All right.
And those would be my picks.
All right. I'm going to jump in here with mine then. I'm going to do a board game pick, as I usually do. This one is called Mlem. It's MLEM. And usually when board games have funny names like that, a lot of times they're acronyms. This one's not an acronym. I don't know why they called it Mlem. And I don't know where they came up with it, but it's cats in space is kind of the theme. And so what you have a rocket and you roll dice to move the rocket up the board. So you each put one of your cats on the rocket, and all the cats do different things. Most of them are bonuses. If you have the most cats on a planet, or it doubles your score on the planet, or doubles your score on a moon, or doubles your score if you get all the way to deep space. But some of them do other things to help the dice and stuff like that. So you put your cats on the rocket, you roll the dice, and then if you have dice that match up with whatever the space you're on says will allow you to advance, then you can advance based on the rules. If you use numbers to advance, you pull all of the dice of that number out and you move up the number of pips showing. If you use boosters, then you put the boosters back in and you keep rolling. So typically people start bailing out when you start running out of dice, because you only roll like 5 or 6 dice to start with. And so if you've pulled 4 dice out and you have to get 2s and nothing else, then you're looking at it and going, the odds of them rolling a 2 are lower than I'm comfortable with. And so you get your cat off the ship and they go and do their away mission on the planet. And at the end of the game, you tally up all your points based on where your cats landed. And if not all your cats landed, then you don't score all your cats. But that's how you win it. It took us about 45 minutes to play with 4 people. And that was the game where we actually learned how to play it. So it's a fairly quick game. It's something that I think my kids, like my 9-year-old, could, pick up and play. And to be perfectly honest, she's nuts about cats. And so she would very much love this game anyway. I think there are some expansions or alternate rules to it. But yeah, so yeah, we liked it with 4 players. Board Game Geek has a weight of 1.69. So like I said, it's a very friendly game for people who kind of like a simple but fun game. And it has a community rating of 8+. So like I said, your younger kids could play it. If you have kids younger than that, they could probably play it. Just might have to help them. And they're not going to understand all the strategy, but it's simple enough to where like I said, I think my 8-year-old could play it and reasonably be able to figure out whether or not she wants to use a particular cat and how to win it. So anyway, really, really enjoyed that game. And then a couple of other things that I'm going to pick. One of them is the TV show Reacher. So I just finished season 2. I am going to warn you, a couple of the episodes have sex, nudity, violence. I mean, you kind of would expect it, I think, from an action show like that. If you want to be able to filter some of it out, my other pick is VidAngel. You can use VidAngel to watch shows on Amazon Prime, Netflix, and a couple of other places. Plus, you get all the Angel Studios stuff on the app. So that's The Chosen. They have a bunch of movies they've made, which are terrific, by the way. And so I'm going to pick Reacher and VidAngel. And you can filter curse words too, right? So if you don't want to hear the F word, then it'll cut the sound.
I heard season 2 wasn't as good as season 1. Do you think that's the case? I watched season 1. I haven't yet watched season 2.
So it was kind of different. I'm trying to think better, not better. It's a little hard for me to specifically. So in the first season, he basically winds up investigating a murder, and a little bit of a spoiler within the first couple of episodes, you figure out that one of the victims is his brother. Season 2, he's investigating, and this comes out right in the first episode. He's investigating the death of one of the guys that was in his special investigations unit when he was in the army. And anyway, it's got kind of the same dynamics with he has other characters that he's doing the investigations with. I would say I probably like season 1 better, but like I said, it's got a bit of a different flavor because it's not kind of the small town, dive into stuff, mystery stuff. But yeah, so I don't know if I have a good answer for that. I enjoyed them both.
If you enjoy them both, then do try to find the series I recommended, Day of the Jackal. It's not the same vibe at all, but I think you'll enjoy it.
Yeah, it's interesting to kind of piece some of the stuff together. Another thing that I'm going to pick, I'm just picking all kinds of stuff today, is a book series. So I'm on book 7, 8 of this series. It's called The Sword of Truth. It's by Terry Goodkind. Just awesome books. I just finished the 7th book or the 6th book. I can't remember, but I'm really enjoying them. This last book was kind of interesting because the primary protagonists that are in the previous bunch of books, they don't even show up in this book until the end of the book. But I think it was a setup for some of the things that are going to happen later. And I think there are like 12 or 13 books in the series as a whole.
You remind me of how Douglas Adams once referred to the Hitchhike Guides to the Galaxy books as his 5-book trilogy. Yeah.
Yeah. Those books are fun too. They're hilarious books. But anyway, so I'm going to pick those. And then The last pick I have is, like I said, if you're watching this live, I'm finishing up all the marketing materials and you being able to sign up for it and stuff like that. And honestly, I kind of want to talk to people before they sign up, just so that I make sure that I understand what people want and make sure that you're a good fit, because it's going to be kind of a pricey deal. But I am putting on an AI Dev Bootcamp starting the middle of January of next year. And so it's going to be a 3-month basically course. You're going to get all the course material up front as I put it together, right, on this first run. We're going to have 6 months where you get on, weekly or biweekly calls. And, so you'll be able to get help as things progress. But, anyway, that'll be at aidevbootcamp.com. I'm also working on putting out some podcasts about AI specifically. We have Adventures in Machine Learning, which tends to get more into data science and machine learning, model building, things like that. These other podcasts are going to be more focused on using APIs and open source systems to build your AI and machine learning stuff. And that's going to be at AI4Ruby.com and AI4JavaScript.com. And so I'm going to get specifically into, okay, how do you build these kinds of features into your apps using Ruby or JavaScript, depending on what you're doing. So those are my picks. Bob, do you have some picks for us?
Well, I'll just do one, and it goes back to the framework discussion in tangentially. About a year ago, David Hannemeyer Hansen did a YouTube video, and I think the name of it is The Cloud Fugitive. I think that's the name of it. And he has taken 37 Signal off the cloud, out of the cloud.
Yes.
And it's a very good video. He just walks through the rationale and why it was a good idea and why everybody else ought to be thinking about it.
So you know what you actually remind me of with that? So we've been forced to buy a new car. So we're actually buying a used car, but it's a new car for us. And they're all the car vendors are trying to sell us on leasing the car.
Yeah.
And we were like, no, we're just gonna buy it. We don't want to lease it. Being on the cloud is kind of leasing your car.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm using.
There are advantages and disadvantages to that. Sorry, go.
No, I'm just saying. I'm doing what he's doing.
No, well, you're paying for comfort, really, or the perception of comfort.
Yeah, but the tooling that they've built around this move has made a lot of this stuff really simple. Anyway,
it's also CapEx versus OpEx and various other similar things that are actually very similar to buying versus leasing.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, Bob, go ahead.
No, that's it. That was just, I thought that's a good video for folks to watch. They can get a different idea of how they could get their systems online, as opposed to, making some big commitment to a company that doesn't care about them.
Yep. Very cool. All right. Well, let's go ahead and wrap it up. Bob, if people want to connect with you or find stuff that you're working on these days, where do they find you?
Cleancoder.com. That's the website. My videos are at cleancoders.com, the plural of clean coder. That's good enough. Twitter, Uncle Bob Martin. I should say X, shouldn't I? It's actually X. I don't have a Blue Sky account. Rather not have one.
To be honest, like I told you, I actually have both, which is really annoying for me. The fact that I need two of essentially the same.
As well?
Yeah, I actually did for a while, but it just it was too much hassle. But it is annoying to have two separate things of exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
If they were different, then okay. But it's like, why do I need to have this twice? It's really annoying in that regard. But I do want to connect with some people who are only on Blue Sky. So,
Mm-hmm. We'll see what happens.
Yeah. Well, the thing that's interesting about it for me, just from the platform point of view, is that I've heard a few people talk about how Blue Sky is maybe cleaner and has less ads and stuff. But if you've been watching the discussions they're having around it, they're looking to add all of that stuff to Blue Sky. So I just, yeah. So it seems
VC
like
money will run out eventually,
Yeah. The decision is not based on what the platform offers. It's other things.
Look, I'm on social network to connect with people. And that's the bottom line.
That's what convinced me to go and create an account over there. But I'm just as inactive over there as I am on Twitter. So anyway,
thank you, Bob, for coming on. This has really been a pleasure for me.
Thank you. Certainly appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, we'll get you scheduled to come back and talk about the history of programming because that stuff's so cool.
Oh man, and I'm a history buff.
Yeah. All right. Well, hang in there for just one more second while we end the stream and make sure you're uploaded. And until next time, everybody, Max out.